So to go ahead and get started, remember the roots of the Vietnam War can be traced back really a long way, but let's start with World War II. Remember that France owned Vietnam. They called it French Indochina initially. So whenever France owned Vietnam, that was one of their colonies, obviously, right? So whenever Germany takes over France, France loses that colony, and that colony is given by Germany to Japan, who we know was starting to get steroided up and starting to take some of these Asian colonies, right? So for a little while there, like a 4 or 5 year stint, Vietnam belongs to Japan. And try to follow this, okay? I know it's a little complicated. Whenever America ends the war against Japan by dropping 2 bombs on it, Japan relinquishes control of Vietnam. Now, here's where it starts to get a little bit confusing for everybody, including Vietnam. Vietnam felt like, well, France doesn't own us, Japan doesn't own us, we must own ourselves. And a guy named Ho Chi Minh, a communist, steps in as kind of a revolutionary power. They're contradictory people in power. There's a guy named Bao Dai who the French really would like to have in power there because he'll do whatever they want. But France essentially says, hey, Vietnam, no, you're not independent. You belong to France. Vietnam doesn't like this, and that begins the French Indochina War. Now, the reason why I backed up so far is because this is where we introduce Ho Chi Minh. And there's a quote by Ho Chi Minh that I talked about in class that I want to talk about again right here because it tells you so much about this war, the French Indochina War, but really, more importantly, obviously, the Vietnam War between America and Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh, before the French Indochina War starts, France and Vietnam, they're trying to negotiate a peace. Ho Chi Minh is at the table, and as it becomes clear that no peace is going to occur, Ho Chi Minh bangs on the table and says, you will kill 10 of ours, we will kill 1 of yours, and you will tire first. Now, I like to imagine that as he left the room, he dropped the mic. I doubt it. Not really a time period for dropping the mic, but he's right. You will kill 10 of ours, we will kill 1 of yours, and you will tire first. Ho Chi Minh is absolutely correct when talking about France and when talking about America. So the French Indochina War lasts from, let's call it 1945-46 to, let's call it 1954. The dates are a little bit sketchy there. While that war is going on, America sends, and I'm going to use this word in quotes, advisors to help France. Because remember, the domino theory, the idea that if one country falls to communism, all of the countries will fall to communism. So we have to protect, right? We have to protect Vietnam from communism because we're protecting the world from communism. So Vietnam gets split into 2, very much like Korea. North Vietnam with the communists in the north, we'll call them the Viet Cong, that's who we're going to fight. And then South Vietnam, which is a democracy, right, that's kind of its own thing, but really it's sort of held together by America. Eventually we'll put a guy in charge there by the name of Ngo Dinh Diem, and then we'll sort of lead a coup to kill him. I'll get to that in a minute. But so Vietnam is split north and south, and in order to protect that South Vietnamese country, America starts to send more, and I put this in quotes, advisors. This starts under the administration of Dwight Eisenhower. It continues into the administration of JFK, John F. Kennedy. During the administration of John F. Kennedy, that guy Ngo Dinh Diem does get killed, the leader of South Vietnam, and Lyndon Johnson is heard in a recording later admitting that the JFK administration is actually the one that killed him because he was starting to make us a little bit frustrated over there. So, like I said, Dwight Eisenhower sent advisors, JFK sent advisors, but the Vietnam War, in the minds of most Americans then and now, is going to belong to Lyndon Johnson. So it's really important to understand with Lyndon Johnson, and we talked about him quite a bit. Lyndon Johnson was JFK's vice president. And it's important to know that because initially he's not elected. He does get elected after about a year or two after JFK dies. He has his own election. He wins in a landslide, actually. He wins running away with it. But Lyndon Johnson is a really interesting guy because he was a phenomenal politician, brilliant, really, really qualified to be president, possibly more qualified than JFK. But Lyndon Johnson had this kind of tragic flaw in that he cared deeply what people thought. If you listen to Lyndon Johnson's phone calls, which have been released, you can listen to a ton of them. He's constantly saying to people, can you believe what so-and-so said about me in the press? Can you believe this? I'm so mad, blah, blah, blah. He sort of pretends not to care, but you can tell that he cares a lot whenever people insult him. And he does care what people think, even though he is a very, very qualified and very, very smart guy. So Lyndon Johnson sort of picks up on this escalation into Vietnam and is the one who's really going to send it over the top. So in 1964, we sort of feel like maybe Lyndon Johnson and his administration are looking for a reason to continue this war, undeclared war in Vietnam. We've got a lot of guys over there, but it's not a war. So in 1964, something happens in the Gulf of Tonkin. And it's important to know what the Gulf of Tonkin is because that's sort of what gets us into this war. In 1964, one of our boats, by the way, this boat is in North Vietnamese water, a place it's not supposed to be. One of our boats is in North Vietnamese water and it gets hit by a torpedo. That much we are sure of. It gets hit by a North Vietnamese boat. That much we are positive of. And people start to ask Lyndon Johnson, hey, what are you going to do about this? We need to make a decision really, really quick. Here's where things start to get sketchy. Reports start to get to Lyndon Johnson of a second attack on a second boat. Here's the problem. That probably didn't happen, and Lyndon Johnson made a decision before he knew all the details of what happened in the Gulf of Tonkin. So Lyndon Johnson goes to Congress and says, hey, I need power to essentially go to Vietnam and win this for us. And they say that's fine, and they pass the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. And so if you're keeping count, this is a lot like the USS Maine in the Spanish-American War, right? Whenever there's a sketchy attack on a boat, we don't totally know what happened, but we use it to enter a war that maybe we should, maybe we shouldn't have. So we get into the Vietnam War. Really, we don't even start out calling it a war, but Lyndon Johnson now has war powers, and we begin to fight in Vietnam. Now, it's important to note, it's important to remember, there is a draft in Vietnam, and we start drafting people almost immediately, and this is where the rub starts, right? Because in general, people support this war when it first starts. But Lyndon Johnson continually, as the years go on, this war is going to last, over 10 years, or right at 10 years, something like that. Lyndon Johnson is going to continually say, listen, this war is just about over. We're doing great. Our boys are coming home soon. And then he'll ask for more troops. And people are starting to say, well, look, one of these, something isn't true here because you keep saying that we're close to winning, but then you keep asking for more troops, 50,000, 75,000, 100,000, right? You remember that protest song that we listened to where it said, the song Lyndon Johnson Told the Nation, and it says, Lyndon Johnson told the nation, have no fear of escalation. I'm trying everyone to please. And though it isn't really war, we're sending 50,000 more to help save Vietnam from the Vietnamese. Remember, that's one of the protest songs that we listened to. So this war just sort of drags on. And really, the Vietnamese bodies, the North Vietnamese bodies, are stacking up. We're killing Vietnamese by the millions, and they're killing us by the thousands. It sort of reminds you of that Ho Chi Minh, you'll kill 10 of ours, we'll kill one of yours, and you will tire first. We are stacking up North Vietnamese bodies, but we're not gaining any territory. Whenever we take a hill, we leave, and the North Vietnamese just come and take it back. And part of the reason why is because we don't know where the North Vietnamese are. We don't always know what they look like. They don't always dress as though they are our enemy. They dress a lot like the people that are just in the villages in Vietnam. So as you can imagine, this leads to, one, us not always knowing who we're killing, and two, us killing a lot of innocent people. And this is an example, the My Lai massacre, if you remember, where American troops just seem to snap and they slaughter a whole village of women, children, and old people, not what we would call non-combatants, right? And this is common in Vietnam. And so in general, like I said, when this war starts, it's pretty popular. It's first couple of years, people understand what Lyndon Johnson's doing. They support him. But as this war goes on, it just gets less and less popular because it just drags on. Our boys are dying, and we're not totally sure why we're there. What is it exactly that we're trying to do in Vietnam is the big question. And this leads to another big problem. This was the first war that really had the media there. Now, World War II had war correspondents. The Korean War from 1950 to 1953 had war correspondents. But Vietnam is a whole different animal. We give journalists essentially unfiltered coverage of the Vietnam War. And what you see is that people sort of see that expression that I love to use, how the sausage gets made, right? How you actually win a war. You win a war by killing lots of people, right? You win a war by doing things that are extremely ugly to look at. And all of that is caught on camera. And when that comes back to America, it sparks these protests from people all over the country. Maybe not quite as many as we tend to think, but there are protests all over the country against the Vietnam War because, one, we don't totally know what we're doing there. Two, our kids are dying. And three, it is ugly to watch. And the popular expression about Vietnam is that it was lost in America's living rooms, right? People watch that and they said, oh my goodness, how can America, we're supposed to be this great country, how can we do these things that we're doing when in reality, that's pretty much what happens in war. A good example of this is Agent Orange, right? I talked a little bit about this in class, but it's a defoliant. Vietnam is mostly jungle, right? And so the idea is that, okay, we don't know where their soldiers are. They'll hit us and then they'll run away. They'll disappear into underground tunnels. They'll disappear into the woods. And so the idea was that if you can get rid of the jungle, you'll know exactly where these North Vietnamese, these Viet Cong are. So we sprayed this chemical defoliant called Agent Orange into the jungle in order to get rid of the trees. The problem is that it caused birth defects to the North Vietnamese for years and years into like the 90s. And so tons of people die from this Agent Orange, which was not an intended effect, but it did happen. It was a side effect of are trying to get rid of the jungle. And that's just an example of that ugly side to war that people hadn't seen before. So this war becomes increasingly unpopular to the point that Lyndon Johnson, whenever he has a chance to run for re-election in 1968, declines. And he says all he wants to do is focus on the Vietnam War. He had a chance to run again and might have even had a chance to win, but he declines. Now that actually, interestingly enough, leads to Robert Kennedy, who may have run anyways, but Robert Kennedy ends up running for president, the younger brother of John F. Kennedy, but he gets assassinated, a guy who might have been president. But what ends up happening, Lyndon Johnson does not run for president, and a guy named Richard Nixon wins in 1968. Now, I'm going to do a whole nother lesson on Richard Nixon because he's hugely important, but Richard Nixon becomes the president. And Richard Nixon, essentially, when he's running for president, says, I have a secret plan to get us out of Vietnam. You elect me, and I'll launch that secret plan into motion, and I'll get us out of Vietnam. And it works. And Richard Nixon, who was Dwight Eisenhower's vice president, he lost to John F. Kennedy in his first presidential run, but he runs again in 1968 and he wins. Richard Nixon starts a process called Vietnamization, getting us out of Vietnam slowly. It's going to be a long process, and he wants to achieve peace with honor, essentially saying we're not just going to win this war the way that we thought we would, but let's get out of it with reasonable terms. So Richard Nixon, over the course of, I don't know, let's call it 5 years, he'll resign from office because of the Watergate scandal. About 6 years after he gets elected, and he's in his second term at that point. But Richard Nixon is able to accomplish, for the most part, pulling our troops out of Vietnam. But not long after, just a matter of months, years or so, the North Vietnamese invade South Vietnam once our troops leave, and they create a unified communist Vietnam. And this is really America's only real loss in a war ever. And it's a brutal thing, and In the end, you see 58,000 or so American troops dead, 200,000 South Vietnamese dead, and something like 3 million North Vietnamese troops dead. And if you go by body count, America wins this war. But if you go by goals and the territory lost, America loses this war. And that's the story.